A while ago, I put a post up on this channel asking if I should visit Norwich Castle Museum while it was undergoing renovation or wait until around summer 2024 when it had been finished. Visiting now won by a very narrow margin last time I looked at it, but also recently someone made a comment that they'd never been in a museum while it was undergoing work, so it seemed like a good opportunity to see what this was like. And you consider this the first part of my visit, as I will certainly go back once the work is done. This video also acts as a slight follow-up on my presentation on the sinking of HMS Gloucester. For those who don't know, only a few days after I posted that video, the wreck was discovered. Well, announced anyway. Originally, it had been found back in 2007, but they were keeping it quiet while work was being done to discover which shipwreck it was. Several artefacts have now been salvaged from the wreck and are on temporary display in the museum. Finding the museum itself is very easy. One of the perks of being in one of the most iconic buildings in the city, the Norman castle that dates back to 1067. But the history of the building itself is something I will cover in another real presentation. But it is placed in the centre of the city, only a 6-minute walk from the bus station and a 12-minute walk from the train station. At the moment you can easily see the major work is going on at the location before you even enter. And I will tell you now that the main castle, as well as the dungeons and at least one of the galleries, at the moment this time being the Vikings in Britain gallery, is closed to the public. Due to the work going on, they have reduced their prices for entry. An adult ticket will cost you £7.40, a child's ticket £6.30, under 4s enter for free, and they also offer a twilight ticket that covers 1 hour before closing for £2.50. There are also a number of groups that are entitled to free admission and concession prices, a full list of which can be found in the description. The bridge you cross to enter it is where the gallows I have mentioned in several of my crime and punishment videos was often built when the hangings were public. This is the entrance by foot, but there is also a lift that brings you up from the dry moat bed to the entrance level. From here, follow the signs round to the side to the temporary entrance. When you enter, you'll be greeted by a member of staff, where, if you've booked online like I did, they will simply tick you off and send you on your way, or if not, send you to where the temporary ticket office is. Due to the ongoing renovation work, not only is the museum discounting their ticket price, they're also giving out free tickets to the Museum of Norwich in the Bridewell as well. I've already been there and made a video of my visit, but now I guess I have a reason to go again. And on a slight side note, which I thought was quite humorous, entrance to the museum is incredibly easy, and it was for me. In fact, it was easier for me to get into the castle that day than it was for a film crew and presenter from the local BBC News channel, who were there when I arrived. Obviously something was going on, people didn't know they were arriving, so there was about 5 or 6 of them standing around all making various different phone calls, trying to figure out who they're meant to be talking to and what they're meant to be doing, as I was just breezed in, which was quite funny. With the museum in its current state, you are rather thrown into it, coming into one of the natural history sections, which is also acting as a temporary ticket office. But don't rush through. Take your time and look around, as you may be shocked by what you can find on display here. For me, it was these large birds, called great burstards, that were apparently common in Norfolk and Suffolk until going extinct in 1832. I know things like taxidermy are not for everyone, especially when it comes to involving smaller animals, and can come across as a little cruel. But I think it's important to remember that at one time, this was the only way regular people were ever going to see many of these animals. And if nothing else, you can look at this section and others like it as a glimpse into what museums used to be. A museum of a museum, if you like. After you finish in this room, you take a right through this door, and find yourself in a corridor-style gallery depicting some of the natural habitats found across the county, from Breckland to Braden Water, the North Norfolk coast, and the Norfolk Broads, based upon work by a man named Ted Ellis, who we will cover in future. Once again, this is a taxidermy section of the museum, as most of the natural history one is. Some of these displays I thought looked really good, other ones, they just look a little bit sad, and probably, hopefully as time goes on, they'll be fixed up a little bit more. From here you enter this rotunda area, that at the moment is acting as like the main hub for the museum, and you can go to the galleries however you choose. It's also here you first start to notice the reduced capacity in the museum, with this section here closed off. And here you can also find a screen telling you of what's going on in the main keep at the moment. Mostly it seems to be a push to improve access for people with disabilities, allowing them to access the dungeons and the battlements for the first time. But there is also talk of making it more interactive, which if they do, I hope they either keep it to special occasions or it is somehow restrained, because I always find there's a fine line between bringing actors into situations like this to make it feel alive and turning it all into a little bit of a farce. And I'd rather like them to focus on the whole expanse of it being a museum rather than it just being a royal palace all the time. But as I say, special occasions, if they brought that in, I would be more than happy. And I suppose also the flip side of that is, the way I see it, anything that can introduce kids to history and get them interested in it is always a good thing. I chose to take my journey somewhat chronologically as possible through the museum, so my first stop was Boudicca and Roman Britain. This focuses largely on the local Iceni tribe, a Celtic tribe who once called the area of this country home. It details how they kept their homes, their religion and beliefs, their first revolt in 48 AD, and the Roman backlash that led to the far larger, bloodier uprising nearly 20 years later. Some of the hoards of golden jewellery that have been found in the area, such as a replica of the Snettisham hoard, the original is in the British Museum. But one of the main features in the display is a chariot ride, and this has been a feature of this museum for a very long time. I'm now 28, and it has been here as long as I can remember. In it, you take the role of an Iceni warrior on a chariot when you're called to go to the aid of some locals being accosted by a group of Roman soldiers, who you quickly see off and save the day. It's probably not very historically accurate, but it is for children, and it is a very iconic memory I have of visiting this place while little. I also remember it used to have sound, so I can only assume they had to turn that off due to staff complaints of having to hear the same thing on loop all day when they've got staff put in here on busier days. There are a number of little activity areas and other things for kids to have a go at throughout the museum that I'll point out as and when I see them. The one downside I would say at this room at the moment is there are a number of displays that are currently empty because they are working on them in some way. Obviously, this does happen from time to time, but it does leave places feeling rather empty. As you move on through, Roman Britain takes over, something that does feel very appropriate as it is what very much happened. And the displays here are in many ways mirrored, their beliefs, their way of living, and so forth. There is also a brief but interesting display on slavery in the Roman Empire. You move on through what at the moment is a rather empty section, into the part about Roman life, the discovery of Roman villas in the areas, and items that have been found. Sadly, the screen next to this display was currently broken, so there was no more information on what these things actually were. But overall, there are some great displays with little intricate items that it's great have survived so long. As you leave this display, this is where at one time you came to the stairs that would take you up to the Saxons and the Vikings, but as you see, we certainly won't be going up there today. So instead, we turn right and end up in one of the art galleries. The first part of this gallery is mostly paintings by the Suffolk-born artist Alfred Munnings. Again, someone we will cover in future. Sadly, it's often the case with paintings that they don't look as good in photos as they do in person, but some of these do honestly look great, and I say this as someone who's not very much an art person. But what I can point out is from the next few rooms, the paintings and things that I like the most, such as this one entitled Autumn by Frederick Sandys. He's a member of the West Norfolk militia, relaxing with two members of his family. Interestingly, the bridge in the background is the very real Bishop's Bridge in Norwich, while the rest of the landscape is entirely fictional. There's this painting which depicts the road to Jerusalem, and also attached to it is now a very worn information plaque telling you what the buildings are. And you can't help but wonder how many people in the past, before easy travel and things like the internet, would stand and look at these kind of pictures, trying to work out what it must be like to be in the city. The sculpture of the Children in the Woods by John Bell, one of the folklore stories from Norfolk I will be covering at some point. And finally, this one called Three Hounds and a Sportsman by Peter Titlemans, purely because anyone who has dealt with sighthounds in the past, which these dogs appear to be to me, trying to get three of them to look in the same direction and especially at you at the same time is incredibly hard. And these reactions of the dogs are 100% spot on. On a side note, while I was in this gallery, I ended up by chance having a very interesting conversation with a member of staff from the museum about the site's days as a prison, who told me some of the layout of when it came to the condemned cells, and where, after they stopped being public, the hangings took place, which is going to come in very handy in future presentations for sure. From here, I chose to backtrack through the Roman section and back to the main rotunda, rather than going through the door in front of me at the end of the gallery into another display halfway through. I decided I would finish off the art sections purely for video reasons. As I say, I'm not much of an art person, before I move on to the more history galleries there. So my next stop was the Coleman Art Gallery. As you've guessed, this is the gallery named for the Coleman family, who have a long history with the city. Much of what was in here was originally part of their private collection. And in here you can find several paintings by the Norfolk artist John Crome. It's also in here where the castle holds its weddings. Once again, a lack of art knowledge really does stop me talking too much about this section. But there's a great deal of paintings to the local area in it, and it was very nice to look round. Next I went to visit the museum's latest and currently most popular exhibition, the wreck of HMS Gloucester. Unfortunately, it did not allow photography, so unlike everywhere else, I don't have anything to show for you, but I will describe it the best I can while I find something to put on screen for you to look at. The beginning of the exhibition starts very understated, with some of the first items found: a bottle, the ship's bell, and a brick from the forecastle. But soon picks up and there is a lot to look at. It tells you about the people on board as well as many of the items they found. Some of the items found on the ship are actually placed next to other exhibits from the museum of the same thing from the same time period, just so you can see what it's meant to look like when it's not been underwater for centuries. This main room also shows a short video and an animated sequence leading up to the sinking and the disagreements between the Duke of York, the ship's captain, the pilot, and others. And at the end, it asks you to choose who you think was most to blame for the sinking. At the time of my visit, most people had chosen the Duke. Near this, there is also a wall that shows you some of the small items that were found at the wreck, as well as many of the victims' names, mostly from the nobility and the high-ranking members of the ship, as records for the regular crew are long gone. My only complaint about this room and the exhibit in general is there is in place a bit too much stuff that's filling in for what might have been on the wreck, such as musical instruments, and as much as what they are trying to do, it can end up distracting from the bits that were really there. Now, the second room in the exhibit is a whole other story, and I believe worth the ticket price alone. As well as a timetable of the discovery of the ship, and an aerial view photo of the wreck site, there is a large display showing the contents of two chests found on the wreck, and the preserved contents inside is just remarkable. From things like shoes and clay pipes that you would expect, to tiny pins, items of clothing, combs, wax letter sealant, and even ink. The most remarkable is the lace petticoat, that although has long lost its colour and now stained a muddy brown, is still almost completely intact, and you can even still see the pattern on it, which I found just incredible. There is also a small section on the wildlife that now calls the wreck home, such as an octopus and a crab who has set up home in one of the cannons and is never very thrilled when divers come near it. They have a few bottles from the wreck that have been brought up and still need to be kept in chilled water to preserve them in one tank, which is quite nice. And although they're not currently on public display, they also said they have found several unopened bottles which still contain wine from the 1600s in them. I won't go into detail of everything in all these rooms, as I don't want to spoil the exhibit, and I think if you can see it in person, you most certainly should. I left the gallery by the side door, which brings you into the museum's collection of teapots. Now I'm aware, over the last few months, this channel has gained a number of followers from other countries. And although I don't really like leaning into national stereotypes, yes, this museum in Britain does have a whole room dedicated to teapots and their history. I did not spend a huge amount of time in this exhibit, just enough to look around and get a feeling, look at the designs and see how they've evolved over the centuries. I actually quite like some of the novelty ones they have there, such as this vulture eating a snake, this fish. There is even one depicting the caricature of Margaret Thatcher from the satirical TV series Spitting Image. And the ones I found most interesting, these two First World War inspired ones from the 1930s. It seems quite strange that only 20 years after a war like that, people were making light of it. Next bit, you come to the only bit of the museum that I would class as general history. Some local items, some from around the world: Africa, Nepal, India, even Egyptian mummies. Again, make your way through reading the information panels and you will learn a lot of little things. As I'm sure we all know, there has been a good deal of controversy in the last few years about museums and how a lot of these overseas items ended up here, in fact. I think the Castle Museum does very well and is very open about a lot of the items, especially the ones from Nepal, were looted during the 1904 military expedition, while others have made their way here through trade or being brought honestly from locals. I think they balance this out quite well, as on the wall opposite to these items and talking about how they got them is a display talking about both Britain and more detailed Norwich's involvement in the abolition and the anti-slavery movements. That has given me at least one idea for a new video as well. If you were to follow the corridor naturally, you would go into the museum's natural history section. But I decided to take a break at this point as it was getting around 12:30, and thought I'd go to the cafe in the museum. The service was fast and polite, the food was pretty good. What I had, a sausage roll and a bottle of water. Compared to what you can pay in other museums and cafes, I thought £4 was an okay price. After my short break, I went back to the natural history section. And once again we find a lot of taxidermy. This time though, it's from animals mostly from all over the world, who made their way here through the actions of big game hunts in the 19th and 20th century, such as this Bengal tiger, killed by King George V in 1911. Another one of his impressive displays in here is this Atlantic tarpon, caught by a member of the local Gurney family at Fort Myer in Florida in 1905. What I like best about this section is it does make a good effort to point out this is how they used to study animals, not how they currently study animals, with one section showing the more modern day, up-to-date ways of doing this, and that the shooting and stuffing are very much moments of the past. Unfortunately, this more forward way of thinking came too late for some animals, and they do have examples in here of ones you will only ever now see in a museum, such as the great auk, with a brass plaque above its case reading rather more as an epitaph. Last seen alive in 1844, it joins the dodo and other species that are extinct because of human activity. Although this is a natural history section, do not expect much in the way of dinosaurs and other prehistorical creatures like this. There are no full-size bone casts or anything like that you may find in other larger museums. It does have a few smaller details though, which is quite nice, such as this flipper of a plesiosaur, bone fragments from Ice Age animals, and part of the West Runton mammoth. That although, despite being found relatively intact and in very good condition, due to its size and the cost needed to do so, has never been fully displayed in public, and only a few parts are on display around the country, the rest still in deep storage. There's also next to this I found this display on the advance of humours as well. It's not one I've seen before, so I can only assume it's new. With this done, I returned to the rotunda and then upstairs to the final section of the museum open to the public, a visit to the Royal Norfolk Regiment Museum. At one time it had its own building in the city, but that closed about 12 years ago and has now obviously moved into the castle. I never visited it in its old location, so I can't really say how it's changed. But from what I understand, its move has meant it's had to reduce much of what was on display. It focuses mostly on the regiment in the First and Second World Wars, which, although interesting, does seem a bit of a cop-out, given that the regiment was formed in 1685. Although limited in space, it does cram a lot of detail into the cases, and I do like the little personal items they have all over the place, and often as well telling you who they belong to, such as this pocket watch, which is actually in Braille. It belonged to a Private Abs, who was blinded during the First World War. There is also his business card from after the war, where he set himself up as a boot repairer and mat maker. It gives a nice little snapshot of the Norfolk Regiment, as it was at the time, across the Great War, from the Western Front to Gallipoli and the Middle East. There are even testimonies taken from letters of men who served, the most poignant being these two brothers from the Smith family, one a pre-war regular and the other who joined up during the war. Both were to die just 4 days apart. After this, there is a little section on the regiment between the wars, when it became the Royal Norfolk Regiment. It also covers the setting up of the regimental cottages, some of which can be found just outside of Norwich. So one day we'll walk up and have a look at them together. After this, you enter the section covering the Second World War. In many ways, it is a mirror of the section covering the First that you can find on the opposite wall, telling bits of stories and items displayed from the regiment's service in Europe, as well as the Far East. The men of the 2nd Battalion killed in the La Paradis massacre in 1940, to the total destruction of the 5th and 6th Battalions at the fall of Singapore, and their fate building the infamous Death Railway through Thailand. The 1st Battalion fighting from Normandy to Germany in 44 and 45, and the rest of the war of the 2nd Battalion, fighting as part of the 14th Army against the Japanese in Burma. Once again, this section is really made up by the little things. My favourite being this, the badge Britannia, the symbol of the regiment, taken from a member of the 5th or 6th Battalion at Singapore. It was found on the body of a Japanese soldier killed while fighting the 2nd Battalion in May 1944, and was later gifted to the regiment. This final part of this little section is the regiment's service after the Second World War in Korea and Cyprus, finishing with the regiment's amalgamation in 1959 and the effective end of the Royal Norfolk Regiment. One thing I have to say about this section, and it is just a little bit of a nitpick for me, is when it is describing the Korean War in one section, it doesn't mention fiction in any of the other places. But in that, it mentions that, oh, this was the war that's well known because it was in the TV show and the film MASH, which just seemed slightly weird that they'd bring it up for the Korean War. I know it's true, but they don't say the First World War. Have you seen All Quiet on the Western Front? It just seemed very strange. Bit of a nitpick for me, but we'll move on now. As you follow the balcony round, the next main section there is a small mock-up of a library, where you can read the testimony of some who have served in the regiment over the years. The next section, although mentioning some of the wars and campaigns the regiment took part in before the First World War, such as the American Revolution, the Peninsular War, First and Second Afghan Wars, and the previously mentioned Nepal expedition of 1904, it is more aimed at details towards the daily soldier's life in uniform throughout the years. Although I wish they had made more of this, there are a few uniforms and items on display, but it would have been nice to have a layout of how the uniforms changed throughout the time. And some they stated very much when they were from, and others not so much. For instance, this is the button off one of the soldiers' coats of the regiment. It was found in Canada and was believed to be lost by a soldier as they marched down to join the fighting during the American Revolution. But others are not so clearly labelled and tend just to blend together. Another real standout in this section is a comparison of the type of rations given to a soldier. It shows some relatively modern ones. The one on display dates from 1995, compared to ones from the Second Boer War, including the emergency ration in the metal tins circled on screen. In the description below you will find a link to someone who opened one of these tins, and yes, they even did try a bit of the ration. The final part of the museum that is open to the public can be found on the balcony, and is these display cases, showing some of the medals won by men in the regiment. Sadly, the Victoria Cross ones are currently unavailable. The first one is medals from the Napoleonic War, and this one raises a bit of a mystery for me, and maybe one of you has the answer. The medal at the top right was awarded to a Private Thomas Gentleman for services in the Peninsular War. The bars are obviously the battles he took place in. I was under the impression that until Waterloo, medals were only given to officers. Maybe it's because of the sheer number of battles he was involved in, an exception was made. If you have any information on this, it would be greatly appreciated. My final stop, as always in a place like this, is the gift shop, where you can find the general museum stuff you would expect. Keyrings, pens, toys for children, and books. I was more interested in the temporary shop that was set up selling items for the HMS Gloucester exhibit. And from there I bought a fridge magnet and a book, telling of the ship's life, the wreck, items found on it, and the struggle to bring it to the surface. To be honest, now that the wreck has been made public and more information is coming out, I may make a more up-to-date presentation on that one day. I'm very happy with the items I was able to get, but once again, please always be aware you will be paying gift shop prices. And with this, we come to the end of our visit to Norwich Castle Museum. Overall, it was a great way to spend a day out. I was there for a couple of hours, even with its reduced state, and I do look forward to seeing what will happen with the work, even though I am a little bit nervous in places, as I've said. For me, the standout of this place at the moment is the HMS Gloucester exhibit. It's here until September, around the 10th, I believe, and if you can visit, you should really come down and check it out. As I've said before, I'll say it again, I'm certainly going to go and look at it again. The only negatives I have to say is I wish they would change some of their displays a bit more than they do, especially the ones in the Regimental Museum. It's pretty much identical from when I was first here quite a while ago now. Fixing the broken interactive screens would be nice, or at least putting a temporary list of items there so we can see what's what. And finding better use for some of the dead space in a couple of the exhibition rooms. Now maybe they will be doing this in summer before the place gets busy again, but the problem with this is a good chance that people who have come before this will be the only chance they give the museum as they see it in this state. And finally, one more general thing I just wish to say, and this was also a problem when the place was fully open, is that its time as a prison, although not pleasant, and is not something that grabs the attention of children as much as the castle, I fully admit. But it was a major part of the site's history, and other than a couple of sections in the dungeon, one of which you had to take a guided tour to be able to see. It doesn't really bring it up a huge amount and go into detail of who was here and for what reason and where they went afterwards, whether it be transportation, whether it be execution. I hope this changes. I hope they bring a lot more into this when it's up and running again next year fully. So I will be entirely optimistic on what they will do, other than the couple of little things that are, as I say, a little bit worrying me at the moment. But overall, I can't wait to see what they've done, and I'll definitely be coming here for another video when they have finally finished. I hope you've enjoyed this visit. A link to the museum's website, as well as the sources for any pictures that were not my own, can be found in the description below, and there's also the link to that video I mentioned. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was A Little Bit of History Visits Norwich Castle Museum.